Okay.
Right, comrades, welcome to another meeting of the Workers' International Network. We're dealing with a very important question, perhaps one of, well, the most practically, perhaps the most important question, because the main tactic and the main weapon of the ruling class, traditionally and very much so nowadays, is divide and rule, of how to drive a wedge between workers of different nationalities, different races, different castes, different religions, etc. Any way to get workers fighting one another rather than joining together and fighting against the capitalist class. And I've got to say, because I've just come from, for the first time in my life, I've been to the Durham Miners Gala, which, if comrades don't know, it's an incredible celebration and festival of working class solidarity. Tens or even hundreds of thousands of people come. It's run by by the miners' union, but even though the mines have been shut down decades ago now, 40 years ago by Thatcher. But the spirits and the traditions of solidarity are still alive, and it's a real joy to see it. They gather together with brass bands and all the rest. Having got that off my chest because I'm still buzzing with it. I just got off the train half an hour ago. That is very relevant because that shows the two sides of modern society: the solidarity in the labour movement's traditions and the tactic of the ruling class to get the working class fighting one another on communal grounds. Now, Ireland was one of the first places where the ruling class, or the British ruling class, practiced that tactic and deliberately created a religious divide. And that's been used, of course, with absolutely fatal, diabolical consequences in Irish history, and up until the very day today. We've also seen how racism has also been used, and we've seen in Ireland, both north and south, how there've been horrible outbreaks of racist violence against migrants. So we're very lucky to have three experienced and veteran trade union activists, all of whom have made a really courageous contribution. The first speaker will be Comrade Mike Craig from Northern Ireland. Uh, all the comrades are from Northern Ireland, sorry. But Mike Craig, who's been a trade union activist and a socialist, it's been a lifelong commitment. He'll speak first. We're followed by Harry Hutchinson, another veteran trade unionist and activist and socialist activist, and finally Tommy McKinney, who's got a lifetime of sacrifice and struggle. He was one of the celebrated hunger strikers in the 1980s, and he is, we thought it's a real honour to have him with us today. So, um, first, Mike, the comrades will speak for between 10 and 15 minutes each, and over to you, Mike.
Well, we'll see if my brain, which is being boiled at the minute, will stick it for 10 minutes. Uh, yes, Ireland, the disputed territory, um, was first occupied in the 12th century, and no records exist that I know of what the working class as the way they weren't a working class as we know it today were doing in the 12th century. But the whole history has been one of exploitation and brutality. Uh, Now, Britain wasn't the only uh, colonial power to do this to people around the world, but it was the first one. And it was Ireland was the first colony. Uh, the the place started to be populated by settlers in the 12th century on a very small scale, and it's noticeable the difference that happens later on uh, between if you look at the year 1600, over 90% of land ownership was by Catholic middle class. Well, they wouldn't have been called middle class at the time, but that's basically what they were. Uh, by the end of the century, that was down to below 20%. And then after penal laws come in after, in the next century, that was reduced even further. A big um, sort of landmark that made hatreds and divisions stick for centuries happened when there was a rebellion in 1641. The rebellion was supposed to be a peaceful coup where the disgruntled Irish landowners and middle classes wanted some democracy in their own land. And at this stage, there was an area in the east of the country called the Pale, which was exclusively Protestant and English speaking and controlled by the Church of England. And the Irish rebellion was to go and take over the court in Dublin and impose Irish rule, basically. But it wasn't like what's happened in all of these rebellions. It wasn't very well coordinated, and there was no success in Dublin. And the rebellion moved to the north, where there were a whole lot of violent outbreaks, and there were some terrible things happened where people were driven into the sea and people were burned alive. And somebody recorded, well, several people actually recorded some accounts from some of the people who had been victims of this. And of course, the accounts got exaggerated out of all proportion. You know, claims of 200,000 people, which was more than the number of settlers in Ulster that there had been killed. Of course, the real figure was something like 4,000. And in retaliation, of course, there were a lot more than 4,000 Catholics killed. But because this was recorded and it was discussed in Parliament, and a certain guy whose name I can't remember wrote a book about it, and it became part of the folklore that you can't trust Catholics because this is what they do to you. You know, they're just barbarians and they're untrustworthy and they're just vile people. And this has been handed down since 1641 and has affected every attempt to create a solution ever since. In later times, like whenever you come to the United Irishmen, you had Presbyterians who were Protestants, but they had been settlers from Scotland and they had a different outlook on the way they worshipped. And they weren't accepted by the Church of England. And of course, anybody who says that this has nothing to do with religion is wrong because it has always had something to do with religion. It's not just colonial power being used to take lands and to exploit people. Uh, they exploit it is, but it's been religion has been used in a way to achieve this, and it has become so entrenched. But the United Irishmen were Presbyterians who, like Catholics, weren't allowed to own property, weren't allowed to have any office above, some menial bureaucratic office, and basically had no say in society. And they decided that they would get together and they would call on their Catholic brothers and sisters to uh, join together and create a republic, driving out the British who brought all this misery to everybody. Uh, Again, there was a breakdown in communication and things didn't go the way they were supposed to. And it was after a while, the whole thing failed. Uh, but what it brought about was uh, reprisals in the form of new laws, uh, which made it even more difficult for Catholics, especially, and Presbyterians, to have any say in society. Uh, at each turn, you'll find that the people, like after in 1641, the people who had been the rebels ended up taking the side of the crown. You find then that after 1800, in the early 1800s, after the failure of the United Irishmen, the Presbyterians then got sucked into the mainstream unionism. And you'll find that today, Presbyterians, there's no difference in their outlook as far as British rule is concerned than there is in the Church of Ireland, Church of England. Uh, in the United Irishman's rebellion, there was a mention of working class people because, there was the beginning of industrial capitalism at the time. So there was a working class, especially in Ulster. There was a mention of the men of no property having some input into this, but that didn't really happen. So the working class were excluded again. Uh, Whenever you come up to talking about the trust thing and this siege mentality that the Protestants had, they seem to forget that they were the settlers who invaded the place. But if anybody attacked them, the people who attacked them were such vile people, never thinking, well, what were we doing here in the first place? Well, this.
Mike, can I just tell you, you've had about 10 minutes. So I'm not trying to cut you short, just to let you know.
So
Keep going.
when you come up to the 1880s and 90s, you have a, a Catholic middle class who sort of prepare for home rule. And there were three attempts to have a home rule bill passed in the Parliament, which didn't end up until during the First World War actually getting anywhere. But they were determined, this Catholic middle class, that whenever they did get home rule, that it wasn't going to be run by socialists, or it wasn't going to be a cross community thing. It was going to be run by the Catholic Church and them, and all about power. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Now, looking at this is my view of it. People will disagree with me. Looking at the 1916 Rising. I think that was a mistake that James Connolly, the the only Marxist in the British Isles, actually got involved in it because uh, by this stage we were talking about socialism all around Europe and around the world, and republicanism, which was basically a movement for uh, middle class autonomy, had nothing to do with working class. Uh, should have been dying out, and the argument shouldn't have been about a republic as much as it should have been about socialism. Now, the bringing that forward, we've had 100 years of partition. Uh, there's reasons for the partition. Two main reasons are because in 1919 there were several Soviets set up with local general strikes, um, where workers took over factories and uh, had their own currency and ran the place. And whenever the British Parliament, when the politicians saw that, they thought, well, we can't have give them a united, devolved Ireland, because this is what will happen to it. Will turn into a Bolshevik revolution. That was one reason. The other genuine reason was the fear of the Protestant working class, who had in their droves in 1912 signed a covenant that Home Rule wouldn't take them in because they didn't want to be ruled by the Catholic Church. That's a real fear that I think a lot of people in the Republican movement dismiss. And so the partition was supposed to be a temporary thing until these things could be resolved. And here we are a century later, and that hasn't been resolved. And it hasn't been resolved because you can't resolve it under capitalism. And, if you put class first before territory, religious and cultural uh, freedoms, if you put class first, yeah, I think you have more chance, of doing something about the situation here. I think that's enough, Roger.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. A good start to the discussion. Right, Harry, over to you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, comrades. Look, what I intend to do is to give you some picture of the underlying chronic conditions here, the economic conditions that is affecting the people and the consciousness, particularly amongst the youth here in the north of Ireland. I want to also deal with racism because racism has effectively superseded sectarian violence. The very important issue here. And the third thing, as I was saying earlier, I do want to deal with the present day position on the national question. Now, it's 28 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, the era that was supposed to bring in a new era, reconciliation, prosperity, all that type of thing. And certainly it was brought an end to the Troubles, which everyone welcomed here. But generally speaking, the people of Northern Ireland see Stormont has failed and is failing the people of Northern Ireland. And when you look at some of the areas that we're dealing with in the health, for example, you're looking at a quarter of the population here of about 2 million people, a quarter are waiting for hospital consultant referrals. It's an absolute chronic state in some of the areas. Chronic housing condition. I mean, at the moment, we only build a few hundred every year. And as far as social housing is concerned, there's about 20,000 houses waiting to be built that have passed through planning. And the reason they're not built is because the water and the sewage infrastructure is not in place. They can't be built, even though they're waiting there to be built. There's other areas, again, underlying chronic and cares, it's not even going to be redressed, not even remotely. Now, Northern Ireland, we got about 20 billion subvention from the British government. And at the moment, there's no budget set for this year. And the reason for that is they're falling short by about $1 billion, that they cannot set a budget. So public sector workers are not getting paid for this year. There isn't a budget set. The different departments don't know what their expenditure is. And that is because the way the British rule, and by the way, I think it's all regional governments, is they deliberately cut them short. And the aim of that is to put pressure on the regional government, Stormont no exception at all. They would like to see privatisation of the water. They would like to see more taxes on rates and perhaps more student fees. The aim is to put pressure on Stormont to go down the road of trying to tax the people more and more privatisations. Now, bearing in mind, all of these cuts basically that have taken place in the hospital and education and so on has been under Stormont. It's been the political parties who have been carrying out these cuts. And they had a cosy opposition in the years past. At the moment, they have a bit of a cosy opposition in the sense, oh, we haven't got enough money. So there's a bit of a cosy opposition. And for that reason, it's Stormont for 40% of its lifetime has been, the institutions have collapsed. They've pulled out. But by and large, for every single reason, it has been the economic circumstances. They pulled out for different reasons, but they cannot deliver for the people of Northern Ireland. Mental health, for example, is one of the biggest issues. And you're looking at about 28% of the population here is suffering some form of mental illness, the highest in the UK. Now, a lot of that is not the common mental illness that maybe you have in your area. Mental illness in this country is quite significantly based with the legacy of the past, the trauma of the Troubles. And today, the British government, they're not going to go back and give up the secrets of the past. We've all these inquiries and so on, historical inquiry teams set up to find out about the collusion with the paramilitaries and so on. Today, they're handing out millions to the victims of the past in order to basically pay them off. But we're not giving you the evidence. We'll give you some money. And that too has led to an awful lot of the mental illness that's here in the North End. That legacy in the past, it's still going on because they're fighting for justice. And thirdly, there's large areas of Northern Ireland still under paramilitary control. According to an article in The Guardian, about 15 to 30% of the population is under the control of the paramilitaries, loyalist and Republican paramilitaries. Today, these aren't necessarily the violent well, that's not true, actually, the violent organizations of the, but today they're more the form of gangsters. They run racketeering, they run punishment beatings. Drugs is very much involved under the paramilitaries. And that means that for many people in Northern Ireland, the troubles and the violence has ended. It's still very real on the ground, which is a big relation to mental illness. The second thing is the new era. Where's the integration taking place? It hasn't. It's social housing. 90% of the population live in a Catholic or a Protestant area. Education, 90% of education is Catholic controlled, or the Protestant state everything. Nothing is done about that. Deliberately, nothing is done about that. And the political parties, to tell you the truth, never miss an opportunity of picking up a sectarian issue. It could be parades, flags, marches, Casement Park, the Irish language. They never miss it. I'm not saying it's not an issue in each one of these things. However, they play it against one another to keep the political division separated from both people. They do it very, very well indeed. But by and large, it's nothing more than a game. It's a game between these unionist and nationalist parties to whip up the sectarian division and the consciousness that's there. The key aspect in most of this, and this is where the problem lies, is in the youth. The young people today, there's about as many as maybe up on 20,000 young people who are not in education and employment. And when you look at the hard working class areas, both loyalist and Republican, it is the youth in those hard working class areas where a lot of the problems are stemming from, the racial problems and so on that's taking place. Now, for the last 3 years, there has been quite a significant racial violence that has taken place in Northern Ireland. One of them only a few weeks ago. I can't go into the details, but about a month ago, the whole of Northern Ireland was effectively shut down in the expectation it was an attempted murder attempt by a black man and so on. And public transport was shut down. Businesses closed their shutters for the whole evening. The whole place shut down. And there was a huge racial violence, particularly against migrants in Northern Ireland. Now, this was orchestrated. There was a group that discovered that they had identified a number of migrants in Northern Ireland previously, and had actually given the police the information that they were being targeted. And they were subjected to a lot of burning, burnt out of their own homes, thrown out of their own homes in racial violence that took place. And it is this racial violence. If you were to walk into a Republican area today, yes, you would see the tricolour and effigies of the hunger strikers and so on and so forth, and you'll probably see a Palestinian flag. You walk into a hardline loyalist area, you will see the king and no doubt the paramilitaries of the past, the freedom fighters and so on, and you will no doubt also see the Israel flag. And that, when you see that breakdown in the international context, you're effectively looking at the history of Northern Ireland between the oppressor that was part of the British imperialism here, those that were oppressing, and those of the oppressed, basically the people of the oppressed, basically the Catholic population. Now, when you look at Northern Ireland, there was a significant fight back against racism. And there was a massive rally in Belfast after that violence of a few weeks ago. City Hall had the largest anti-racist demonstration in its history, probably one of the largest rallies ever at the City Hall. And so there's a massive fight back from the working class against the racial violence that's taking place. Well over 85% condemned the rioting and so on and so forth. But when you look at the small population, maybe around 8%, 10% believed it was justified. And then you go into the polls of the Unionists thinking on this here, 52% of Unionist voters said that the violence was justified against the migrant community. And again, we're seeing in racism the historical background to the Northern Ireland problem, the Irish problem, that it's justified and so on. We don't in Northern Ireland have a migrant problem. Our population here is about 3.4% foreign people living in the country. The rest is the rest is made up. But it's that small percentage that is where the violence is stemming from is very much based on the poverty and predominantly the youth. This is where the problem is in those hardline. They were the ones that were out on the streets burning people. The paramilitaries themselves was partly organizing certainly behind it. Racism has now replaced sectarianism as the main elements of violence in Northern Ireland. And that's causing a massive problem that we have here. If we go on to where we are now, where we are in the national question, there has been some rather not insignificant, if you want, pressure on dealing with the national question, particularly towards border polls. And there's probably a number of reasons for that. One, we've seen the increase in the Sinn Féin vote. Now, that's largely at the expense of the SDLP, the moderate SPL. Sinn Féin today is the largest political party in Northern Ireland. They're the ones that are the first minister in the north of Ireland. So electorally, That's never happened since partition. And when you with the failures of Stormont, Sinn Féin in particular is under enormous pressure to deliver something to the people. They can't do it in economic circumstances. So when you look at the national question, it has dominated politics in the north and in the south of Ireland for a century, and still dominant. And that's a deliberate policy to keep that at the foe, at the head. The third thing is there's been a slight increase. The Catholic population in Northern Ireland is slightly now above that of the Protestant population. It's I think it's 40. It's about 1 or 2% now Catholic population. So again, that maybe is bearing a little significance. And the third thing is Brexit. Brexit. The majority of Northern Ireland wanted to remain in the European Union. So what we're seeing today is the economic factor creeping into the national question. I mean, for example, Michelle O'Neill, she didn't say it bluntly, but she hinted at it, that if there is a border, she wants a border poll by the end of the decade. And she hinted at it that if there isn't one, she may bring the institutions down if there isn't a border poll. And they putting pressure on the British government. Now, under the Good Friday Agreement, if the Secretary of State thought that there was a groundswell of opinion for a border poll, they would be subjected to call one. And that would be a border poll. It would be an all-Ireland border poll if that was to take place. Now, if you look at any border poll that would come into Northern Ireland, first of all, in the Irish Republic, it would be easily passed from the 20 people in the 26 counties. It would probably be passed by about 63, 65%. The only issue that they have is could they finance Northern Ireland, the 6 counties, from Dublin and not from Westminster? In the north, if there was a border poll, according to fairly recent polls, you're looking at just under 50% would oppose it. They would be against it. Incidentally, and roughly about 35% would support a border poll in all Ireland. Incidentally, that if you had a border poll and that Northern Ireland would go back into the European Union, which it would in an all-Ireland context, there would actually be a higher increase in people who would vote and be in support of a united Ireland. We're seeing some softening in the unionist community of this, the kind of middle-class business people who are seeing the economic circumstances taking over the political circumstances. It's kind of reduced the opposition within unionism, as you want, because the economic factors is creeping into this national question now, more so than I think we've ever seen in the past.
Harry, now, you've had 15 minutes just to tell you.
Well, then,
I'm not trying to shut you up. Carry on.
I'll tell you. I'll finish. I will finish on this, Roger. I will finish on this. If there was a border the border poll, we were going down to that. Ireland would be effectively. It would mean one or two things of a model of a united Ireland. It would either be the northern state would be entirely engrossed into the southern state, so all 32 counties would be ruled by Dublin, or the northern state would have its own, perhaps separate state, only this time it would not have the allegiance to London, it would have its allegiance to Dublin. That's the model of what would happen if there was. The Irish would have to have their own separate referendum in order to change the constitution. The point of all this, and this is what I'll finish on, Roger, as a socialist, we have always said there is no solution to the Irish national question under capitalism. And I think that position has been borne out with time, because any attempt to impose a solution, as Sinn Féin is currently trying to do, maybe even Tommy might come in on the legislation in the Dáil. They're trying to put some meat on the bones in this national question and raise it and try to push for a border poll. But we have always said, if you impose a solution under capitalism, it runs a serious risk of civil disturbance. And what we've seen, even around racism, but other issues as well, that is almost certainly going to happen. And it wouldn't be a spontaneous violence. We believe it would be a prolonged violence. And to impose this at this particular time, particularly with the conditions and the youth that we have today in these areas, that would not just be spontaneous and be over in a few nights. We think there would be a prolonged. The national question has been used against the people in Northern Ireland to keep them divided. That will not stop under capitalism. Even border poll, even a united Ireland, that will always remain. That is how they've controlled us in the past. Our approach to the national question is we believe in the unity of the working class, uniting the people around the programme of socialism in the north and in the south of Ireland, to take these issues up from a socialist perspective and then move on issues on the national question. Our position on a border poll is we would be opposed to it. Reason is it will solve nothing and risks inflaming the situation from imposing a solution from the top. We believe it's the working class people united under these issues that we have to move forward on the economic issues and on the national question as well. It's the working class that this has to be based in, not an imposition from the top. Roger, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Harry. A forthright and, of course, controversial point of view. Tommy, it's over to you. We're very welcome. I'm sure this will spark off a lively discussion. Tommy?
Thank you, Roger. I'm not sure that I would necessarily disagree with everything or anything, or even a lot of what Harry has said, because his assessment of the 6 counties of Northern Ireland is, accurate and depressing. I think at the same time, what we have to look at is the likely outcome or the direction of travel in this part of the world. One thing we have to look at too is why the British have decided to stay, why they had occupied the country for so long, and what their reason at the present would be if it still exists now. The time of partition, 1921-22, Britain was probably still saw itself as the global superpower, although obviously that was being challenged after its failure to single-handedly win the First World War. It was experiencing the rise of the American US century, as we call it. But at that time, because of its position in the world, the British needed, or felt they needed, or believed they needed to have a controlling say in Ireland for strategic reasons, to defend the western shores of Britain from attack. Now, right into the 60s, there was a similar calculation, because we were talking about post the Second World War, we were still talking about the Cold War and feeling. Now, as times have went by and years have passed, Britain is no longer a global superpower. It's diminished in terms of its global impact, and technology has meant a lot of what would have been necessary to have strategic positions in Ireland has been diminished largely. For example, access to the deep water ports in Derry to protect the North Atlantic. Do they need that any longer? When you have submarines that can lie off the coast for months with nuclear weapons, when you have satellites to observe, so for different reasons, it's questionable whether the British have the same interest in boots on the ground in Northern Ireland as they would have had in the past. Also, with the globalisation of industry, Northern Ireland, which at one time was a valuable asset in terms of shipbuilding and heavy industry, no longer really an asset. It's a drain on British resources. Now, I think moving along with that is the fact that Harry has talked about. There is a demographic change in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. So the Catholic population is increasing slightly at the moment, but at the same time, I think when the examination of the age profile, it's possible. I think it's deemed to be fairly inevitable that in the next number of decades, now not the next few years, but maybe 3 to 4 decades, there certainly will be a Catholic majority. Now, the fact is that at that stage, it's highly likely there will be a strong demand to end partition via a referendum of some description. And it's my opinion that the British state, the deep state, has this calculation, and they're quite aware of the direction of travel. Now, at that stage then, we're looking at what the British wish to see in Ireland. Now, if they've no longer an interest in actually keeping boots on the ground or need to keep boots on the ground by physical force, I think they're going to make a calculation that Ireland would be best controlled through basically capitalism. So therefore, what they're looking for in Ireland is not necessarily to garrison the island, but to have it controlled with the help of a capitalist class in Ireland, compatible with British capitalist interests as well. So I think we're going to have to look at the distinct possibility that in the next number of decades there will be an end to partition. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there will be acquiescence from all, but the thing is that there's a drift at the moment to accept that south of the border as well as the north of the border, because we have a traditionally ultra-conservative, actually deeply right-wing party, Fine Gael, which had its origins in the 1930s fascists, has now proposed that they'd start up to accommodate a plan for an all-Ireland consensus, which is unusual in many ways, that they're actually in some ways competing with Sinn Féin in terms of talking about a United Ireland. Now, United Ireland, the thing about it is that what we're talking about, they're no longer actually talking even about, in many ways, about a republic, certainly not a workers' republic, but talking about a United Ireland, which will be united under effectively a capitalist construction. And the fact is that as long as Northern Ireland remains divided, as Harry has pointed out very accurately, that one, the chances that there'll be effective reconciliation in terms of an agreement that make Northern Ireland work, it's not going to work because the two sides are keeping apart, which will mean that in the decades to come, that those people within the Catholic, nationalist or Republican communities will probably vote to end partition. So I think that's the calculation that will be made. So on that basis, I think it's necessary then to look at the outcome of this. So while I've got to recognise this inevitability, I think that there will be, now, as I say, not within the next 2 or 3 years, but possibly over the next 2 to 3 decades. And I think while many of us around this table might not be alive to see it, I think we've got to at least lay the groundwork for what's to happen. We've got to advocate definitely for a workers' republic as distinct from just United Ireland. And I think we've got to take care that while in the past there has been obviously the religious distinctions have been exploited for sinister purposes, to prop up a capitalist regime, that it's not an inevitability that the two sides will always be, the working class will always be divided. There's shortly to come out a book by a professor of history in Belfast, which details a whole series of trade union activity in the central part of Ulster in the late part of from about 1915 to 1920, and there was a massive unionisation, considerable solidarity, to such an extent that on one famous occasion there was a strike of workers in a place called Caledon, which those of us in the north of Ireland know quite well for different reasons. But the strike was led by a man called Padre O'Donnell, an Irish Republican, and on one occasion he was led up through the town leading the strikers with a local orange band, which demonstrates the fact that there's no genetic reason why Catholic and Protestant worker will forever be separated. But we have got to work on that to ensure that we're not talking about a United Ireland, we're talking about a workers' republic. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tommy. Now, we've got other Irish comrades here. We've also got comrades from other countries that are facing very similar issues or have faced periodically. Comrades from Cyprus, comrades from India, and comrades from the USA. So everybody is welcome to participate. Who wants to come in first? Dominic. Yeah. Oh, is it Dominic or John?
It's Dominic. Yeah, I just wanted to make a few points about the sort of growth of the foundations of imperialism in Ireland, because I think it's important to note that the British role, or the Norman role, to be more accurate, in Ireland started in about around 1200, somewhere around that, and it was one of the tribal chiefs or clan chiefs in the Leinster area was having problems with other clans in the area, and he called on a guy called Strongbow, who was a Norman warlord who was, I think, married to his daughter. And Strongbow came over with his army and established basically a foundation for the Normans around the Dublin area they call the Pale. And I think the thing was that at the same time, a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth, some sort of monk, some sort of learned person, was putting out propaganda that as far as the Irish were concerned, they were all savages, they went about naked, they ate raw meat, they didn't know anything about Christ, and considering, that you were talking that the main culture of Europe was Christianity, forgetting the fact, if you like, of the foundations in Britain by Irish monks and all the rest of it, and throughout Europe of Irish monks prior to this period. It's just a total set of lies, but it's a foundation of imperialism, as Engels said. The British capitalists, the British lords, established used that island as an anvil on which they hammered out their imperialist program. That's been the same ever since. That, if you like, Britain didn't go into conquer a place or what have you. It went in to help to civilize it, and that's been the tale ever since. And this sort of propaganda has continued, throughout Irish history. If you think of the what you call it, James II and William of Orange, nobody ever seems to mention the fact that the Pope was supporting William of Orange, who was a Protestant, against James II, who was a Catholic, and financing William of Orange's war funds. He was financing that situation, and I think after that position, this whole situation in Ireland was that Presbyterians were persecuted by the establishment, as comrades have said before, through the Church of Ireland, the similar branch of the Church of England, and that they were penalised. They had to pay tithes to that church, and there were lots of rebel movements by Presbyterians at that stage, going on. So I thought I'd just mention those points. But I think today, as far as it goes, I mean, as far as Britain's concerned, the British capitalists are concerned, in the early 60s, they were looking at ditching Northern Ireland because, as far as they were concerned, it was a major drain on their resources because of the requirements of health service and all the other services to go and support the people. And that was when the time that you started getting splits with the establishment in Stoneham, and you got the rise of the likes of Paisley and the Democratic Unionists. And on the other side, you got the situation in the South, where there was moves to the left in the population and a fight for better rights. And the IRA was the right wing of it were approached by the government or government ministers to establish a situation in the north where there would be none of that sort of nonsense going on. It would be purely on a national question. And that's when the IRA, or the provisional IRA, were established, and that's what they fought on. And there are illusions in the left in Britain that the IRA is some form of left-wing organisation. And when you look at what they were doing during the Troubles, there was ethnic cleansing throughout the north, in Belfast, in Derry, and places like that, where Protestants were driven out, and that the Protestant paramilitaries were playing the same sort of game. So as far as we're concerned, I think we've got to say that there's no solution, and hammer it home, there's no solution in Ireland without the working class intervening and becoming the dominant political power, and then raising the whole question of a socialist united Ireland as far as it goes. I'll leave it at that.
Right, thanks, Dominic. Finn?
I want to begin by thanking the three comrades for their opening contributions and the important information they've given with regard to the economic situation that people face, plus the political difficulties that are around the corner, around issues at the border, poll, and so on. But it's very important to be positive in discussion of this nature. And it's one thing to say the working class are the only class that can solve this problem. That's correct. But how is that going to come about? What kind of work needs to be done to accomplish that? First of all, regardless of all the sectarianism, the divisions, the killings, the settlements, so-called, the various deals, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions unites workers north and south. It's a common organisation which isn't widely known. The trade union movement has not split between north and south. It has not split between Catholic and Protestant, and that unity has been maintained. Not just the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which encompasses all the trade unions in the country, north and south, but individual unions also organise north and south. For example, the Irish National Teachers Organisation organises north and south. Unite organises north and south. And that essential trade union unity has remained throughout all the troubles and all the difficulties. It's very important that comrades and people whom we have association with get involved in the trade unions to build the organisations into fighting organisations. First of all, everybody should join a trade union. Then people should get involved in making policy in the trade unions, taking part in the increased militancy which is now occurring in the trade unions, and developing a socialist programme within the unions to resolve the questions that comrades face. Perhaps the best example of the importance of trade union unity and trade union involvement was in the recent demonstration which Harry referred to, the huge demonstration in the north. That demonstration was supported by the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And that's a significant point which we can't overlook. It's not just people turning out on the streets. The dangers posed by racism, violence, and burning people out of their homes has been well explained by Harry, and that's got to be fought. But when the people mobilised, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions came out and helped to develop and extend and expand the influence of that movement. And we must always bear in mind the positive aspects. So it's one thing to call for workers' unity. The way in which workers' unity is expressed is through their unions, through their branches, through the various union bodies. In my own work in the Trades Council in Dublin, we often encounter workers from the north. For example, the Derry Trades Council is a very active body, as is the Belfast Trades Council, our other trades councils across the country, and we organise on a national basis. And you can't be involved in the Trades Council unless you're a member, an active member of your individual union. So people have to become involved in that. On the political front, Sinn Féin, the points Dominic made are correct. You know, I was at that conference in 1970 when Sinn Féin split between what were known as the Provisional Sinn Féin at the time and the title Official Sinn Féin stuck for a short period as well. I was at that conference, and that was, as Dominic explained, an attempt by the Fianna Fáil government in particular to split Sinn Féin because the organisation was moving to the left at the time and had become involved in housing action, protests, civil rights activity in the north, and other such activities. And the Irish government under Fianna Fáil, Jack Lynch, who was the Taoiseach at the time, wanted to confine the conflict to the north, fighting on the traditional issue of Irish unity and to keep away from economic and social issues. Now, the present perspective for, well, Provisional Sinn Féin as it was then has now evolved into a far different type of organisation. It's now a mass organisation with a lot of support, north and south. But the strategy of Sinn Féin now is to win the position of Deputy Prime Minister, or Taoiseach as it's called in the south, for Sinn Féin. Get Mary Lou McDonald into the government as Deputy Prime Minister or even as Prime Minister, depending on how the polls turn out. You have Michelle O'Neill in a similar position in the north as the First Secretary. And then they'd be able to unite the two leading Sinn Féin figures, north and south, and describe that in some way as a step towards Irish unity, which of course is incorrect. It's the policies that they stand for and the programme they stand for which will decide the questions, which will decide that question of unity. The main issues in the south are not the national question. The main issues in the south are housing, education, health, transport, not the national question. There haven't been big demonstrations or protests or movements around the national question. Now, the issue has to be resolved, and as Dominic has explained, and others have explained, they can only be solved on a socialist basis. But the big questions in the south, which are mobilising people and making people conscious, are issues such as housing and health, massive waiting lists, inadequate spending, a split health service, private and public. These are big issues, and housing, of course, is a massive issue with big numbers, particularly of younger people unable to find a place to live. So, as I said, the main issue I want to emphasise is to be positive. For comrades to see the positive activity that's happening. The attempt by workers to transform their unions is happening north and south. The increasingly people looking towards industrial action by their own unions to fight for issues with regard to pay and wider issues as well. There'll probably be strikes in the south shortly around this question of a new pay deal. There have already been strikes in the north, or movements in the north about pay and conditions in the civil service. So it's important to be positive, comrades. Even though the points that have been made are accurate and correct, we have to see how can we achieve the goals which we've set for ourselves and for society.
Yeah, thank you, Finn. Matthew, you're next.
Thanks to the comrades for the presentation. I thought it was very useful at the time, obviously, given the date and so on. I mean, the thing is, obviously, this also has an effect in Scotland. As you know, there's a great split in the working class between basically. Although, of course, what we've seen is a it's a dissolution. I mean, if you go back to like the 70s, early 80s, the Orange March, which took place, which would normally take place last weekend, would actually amount to in excess of 100,000 people in Glasgow. And would basically bring the city to a halt. These days, of course, it's down to a few thousand and takes place with nobody really noticing it, other than those who are actually interested. So in that sense, it's a good thing. In other senses, it's difficult because what's happening, of course, is that first off, obviously, the failure of the left. I mean, what we've seen, obviously, is that the political collapse of the left in Scotland into Scottish nationalism. Which of course there's no association, basis of socialists. I mean, the notion of a socialist independent Scotland is quite bizarre and is currently being peddled by virtually all the left groups. under in the conditions of imperialism. It's purely impossible, and also, of course, is mainly a distraction, and quite a dangerous one at that. And what we're getting at now, of course, is that what that relates through is you can see, there's obviously still this sectarian split which runs through the working class, and so we see, historically the Protestant Orange working class voted Tory. So there's Scotland actually last voted majority Tory, 1955, and that continued. And what happens with the rise of Scottish nationalism, of course, is that we have the Orange working class then moving towards the Labour Party, which is obviously historically a Catholic organisation, certainly in these parts. And then, basically in order to strengthen a bulwark, if you like, against Scottish nationalism, and that then effectively the Scottish Labour Party is now collapsed or near collapsed. It's now run by two businessmen. It's got virtually it's got very minimal base in an ageing section of certainly an ageing section of the working class is its base of support, and it receives less than 20% of the vote. So what we're seeing on the ground, though, is of course a split with the rise of racism between the fascists. And we've seen, obviously, effort by the fascists to try and organise in Scotland over very many years, and the Orange working class, which I think the Orange organisations have far more of an affiliation with the state through various channels and the rest of it, and so we're very, very wary of any kind of deal or organisation with the fascists. But what we're seeing now is the ability, because of now racism is being promoted essentially by the media and by the ruling class itself, is now we're seeing racist protests, which are not, interesting enough, are then bringing together both the fascists and a section of the Orange working class. And you have to remember, in across a bunch of central Scotland anyway, the place has never actually recovered from Thatcherism, and obviously we had mass industry, and what you had was obviously basically people being expelled from the workplace and left. So you've got areas which still essentially were built, places that were built essentially to serve particular factories or particular industries, and those industries are gone. People are just left, and those people who people in those areas who can get educated and so on and so forth generally leave. So it's very strange, sort of this promotion of that on that basis. But what we're seeing, is that on the basis of this rise of racism, particularly in the recent times, is that all the forces being brought together. The left actually has succeeded in keeping the fascists down and from walking around in this city. They can't do it. But what they can do is to have what they would call spontaneous protests, which are extremely difficult to mobilise against. And actually, what happened, I don't know, the most recent one in the north of Ireland has provoked a series of events in Glasgow, and of course efforts by. We've actually, the interesting thing is we've actually had an English fascist been arrested on one of the estates in Glasgow, who was taking part in one of these quote spontaneous protests, generally organised online against a house said to house asylum seekers, and of course was empty at the time, and he turns up on the street raising a great cry against Fenians. Of course, as everybody knows, seen by them and certain people as an insult. The fact that a chunk of the crowd he was actually addressing was made up of Catholics or nominal Catholics and therefore Fenians, he didn't seem to appreciate. So the cops promptly arrested him, probably for his own safety as much as anything else. But you can see that sort of process taking place, and it's difficult to see how that will work out. Obviously, it's like this sort of locked process of decline, which I think is running through everything, because we're still in this austerity period, and the government will now, with the demands to go towards greater spending on defence, we'll strip far more public service, far more. So we're going to see the huge amounts of stuff being taken away from people, and the question is what the response is, and can the working class actually come together and produce it? The problem being, of course, is that the existing organisations are just have no basis, have no political basis to actually fight that, and the unions have not fought austerity or the removal of public services and so on and so forth. So we're going to have, it's going to be a process, political process, and in terms of actually understanding both the nature of the thing, into how to organise. I mean, also at the back of it, I mean, in Britain, we have to raise the question and say, look, Britain needs to remove itself from Ireland, because then, as Marx and Engels did point out, those who oppress another nation cannot themselves be free. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Matthew. Of course, most of the trouble spots in the world are the direct result of the actions of British imperialism in creating communal conflict. And one of the examples of that is Cyprus, which has also been partitioned. So, Comrade Themos, I'm sure you have a lot of ideas to offer.
Well, Cyprus had a long history of sectarian troubles, nationalist troubles, and most of it is started in the period of British rule. And when the rising against British rule was taking place, it was not according to most of the colonial world anti-colonial struggle, but it was with a specific aim of joining Greece. There are historical reasons for this. I don't want to go into it. But the British promptly used the Turkish Cypriots as an auxiliary force, which gave the opportunity for a lot of killings between Greeks and Turks, and making the situation intolerable. I think there was just a real responsibility from the church, which was leading the anti-colonial struggle in Cyprus, and certainly the Turkish nationalists who were trying to avoid a repeat of the experience of Crete, which was from which the Turkish population was expelled when they joined Greece. But I'm a bit skeptical when we discuss how to deal with these ethnic struggles and these national questions, because it's easy to say there is no solution under capitalism, but which may well be true. But on the other hand, we should realize that nationalism is not something that is completely artificial. It is there. There are sentiments. There are cultural differences on which the capitalists built their policies of divide and rule, and we should have some sort of policies towards that. I mean, we have been saying that there is no solution to the Cyprus problem, remember, since the 70s and the 80s. And at some stage, you even said, okay, there is no solution, so let's fight for socialism. It got us nowhere. The problem was not solved. There was no effective joint work between the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot working class. The division continues to exist and is getting even deeper. There were some very important periods in which the struggle was was joined, and we managed to form bi-communal groups, bi-communal forces that would fight together for some sort of solution. We homed in on trying to build to find a federal solution so that we would stop being divided in everything. We failed again and again. But if we didn't have this focus, that the first thing to do is have a joint position and a joint work towards whatever struggles we have, we will neither get a solution nor socialism. One of the biggest successes of our organization, Cyprus, that we established a yearly conference of the left with the title "The Left and the Cyprus Problem," which managed to get together all the organizations of the left from the main parties of the left like AKEL and the GTP, to the smaller parties, and even to each and every sectarian or revolutionary group that exists, not with the aim of finding a common position that would be fine if it came up, but the aim was to bring them together so that we will start feeling that the left, both Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot, it has something common, and we should build on this basis. I think we had a great success in this. I mean, we are not yet one big organization, but we talk to each other, and the main parties stopped looking at the small organization as something completely foreign. The small organizations stopped hating AKEL as and GDP as a hostile organization, because this unity of the left is very important, and we are trying to put some programmatic ideas that slowly are becoming becoming commonly accepted among most of these organizations. So I would say yes, working together is the main thing. Having a program is very important that is common to all of us, but the main thing is that to bring the left together, to understand that we cannot remain split on sectarian lines, on nationalist lines, because that's the worst thing. Now, if we came very close to having a solution to the Cyprus problem. It wouldn't solve everything. We would have to continue from there, but at least we would work together and not separately. And I think this is the important thing: not to preclude anything, but to discuss and find ways of bringing some simple, direct program for the working class to work towards both socialism and the reunification of the country.
Thank you, Thomas. Is it Dominic or John now?
John.
John, yeah, welcome.
Just like to relate an incident that happened to myself in terms of the situation in Northern Ireland and the divisions of Catholic and Protestant workers. I was for many years a councillor in Manchester, and they had the situation where in the late 80s the leadership of the Manchester City Council was left-wing Labour, and they invited Sinn Féin to come to meet the leadership of the council and have a reception. Now, I'd been in Northern Ireland and Donegal, well, for many years I used to go on holiday, but it was at a time when the Protestant paramilitaries were threatening to kill any Catholic worker found in a Protestant area, and where the nationalists, well, the IRA and the INLF, or whatever it was called, threatened the same for Protestant workers who were working for the Crown. Now, in my sort of tour of Northern Ireland, but it wasn't a tour, it was more a tour of Derry and a few of the pubs, I came across quite a few papers and press cuttings where NIPSA, which was the main union of public service workers, were putting out very serious statements telling the paramilitaries to back off in no uncertain terms. But as far as NIPSA was concerned and the trade union movement was concerned, they were there to try and help people in need, whether it was a housing problem, social services, education, or other, if you like, public sector things. So what I did, I collated a whole load of these press cuttings and duplicated them and distributed them to members of the Labour group. Unfortunately, at the time, I was involved with militant, and I got absolutely no support from the local full-timer. I was told basically, keep it quiet, we're not getting involved in this. And basically to support the Sinn Féin trip to Manchester. Well, I didn't. I put a resolution or amendment to the council agenda saying that Sinn Féin should not be invited, that workers' representatives should be invited to address the city council, from Northern Ireland, and to tell them what the situation was. So it came to the council meeting, and the Tories and the Labour members of the council were goading me. How would I vote? Would I vote to stop the refreshments, because that was the item on the agenda, and vote with the Tories? Or would I support the IRA and support and vote with Labour? So when it came to it, we had a name vote. And I said, well, what I'm doing, I'm abstaining, because I'm not voting with Tories and I'm not voting with this nonsense that the leadership of the council, the Labour leadership, were putting forward. That we should be supporting, if you like, those in Northern Ireland who are fighting for workers' unity and fighting, in a very real public way against the paramilitaries. So because over the last few meetings we've had, Northern Ireland has come up, and I think it's important to realise that in the north, the trade unions have been very active, and also not just on that, but when Stormont's been suspended, which has been suspended for many months at a time, the trade unions have argued that the pay of the Stormont members should be stopped because they're doing no work. And I've had friends of mine were made redundant because they worked in areas of charities dealing particularly with social services issues and just laid off. And there were many demonstrations throughout the north. So I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Oh, thanks. Very interesting comment, John. Are there any other comrades who want to come into the discussion? It's a bit early to close the meeting, but it might be an idea for the three comrades who opened the discussion. If you'd like to come back, maybe that will stimulate more discussion. Should we say reverse order? If that's okay with the comrades? So that would be Tommy, then Harry, then Mike. Is that okay?
Okay.
Tommy, over to you.
Not sure how much I can add to this discussion. Fact is that I think we've got to take a look at the facts as they're happening. that the fact that I've got to remain optimistic, I think, is certainly true. That, however, I think we can't put too much emphasis on the trade union movement in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. There's obvious difficulties exist, and maybe we've drifted into a utopian situation by putting too much emphasis on the power of trade unions in the north of Ireland to resolve our problems, although quite obviously we have to think in terms of the organised working class. But there remains the fact that as long as the constitutional issue remains unresolved, it's going to ensure that there will be divisions between, well, I suppose to use the terms Catholic and Protestant in Northern Ireland. And that when the constitutional issue is definitively resolved, I think then there's going to have to be a different approach taken to what divides the working class at that stage. So I think we've got to look at definitively ending the constitutional issue, and at the same time also advocate the need to promote workers' unity.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. Harry?
Yeah, thanks. I want to comment on two very important points that both Finn and Thamos has raised there. Just the first thing is, I mean, if you traveled to Northern Ireland and traveled about here, you probably wouldn't find a society much different from where you live. Yes, you would walk into some areas that, you would see in colours of Union Jacks and tricolours and so on. That certainly is the case. But by and large, it's a fairly normal, inverted commas, society. This is the 12th of July today. All over the 6 counties, the north of Ireland, there are orange parades going on commemorating the Battle of the Boyne of 1690. And that hasn't stopped in all of those years. Orange parades. But more interesting is the night before. They're known as the 11th night bonfires. Now, although Mike and I had a social venue to go to last night, for the last few years, we've been going along and having a good look on the ground. These are bonfire nights. They're massive pyres made up of pallets of wood and so on. But more importantly, in the previous years, you had normally sectarian pictures on them. Maybe Michelle O'Neill, the First Minister, Sinn Féin, sitting up there, or maybe whatever. And they're very political in the past from a sectarian point of view. Now they've changed to a very racist point of view. There was one in a small village here not far from where I live, actually, in County Tyrone. They had a replica model of a mosque, of a Muslim mosque right at the top of it. So they've taken a very, very much form racist connotations, these pyres. They set them alight. There's about 300, I think, throughout the north that were burning last night. And, it's caused even burnt down 2 residential homes in the process. But the point is, it's not until you go into an event like that there do you really see the crux of and stem from where the problem lies. You will see swarms of young people, drugs, alcohol, getting drunk. You will see very, very small children being indoctrinated into this sectarian stroke racist, now racist, political orientation. It's an indoctrination that has gone through generations, and even the new generation, and I mean young generation. And you can see where the real problem is going to stem from, the real violence is going to stem from when you take yourself off to one of those 11th of the night bonfires. Extremely, extremely interesting. It's not a bit intimidating, I have to say, at the same time. Now, Finn has raised a very important point about intervention. And there has been trade union intervention in the past. 1992 was a decisive turning point. I'm part of a small trade union council here in Mid-Ulster. It was an atrocity that happened outside, actually not very far from where I lived. I can't go into it. But what we called for then in our small trades council was an anti-sectarian strike against all paramilitary killings, including state killings. And we called on the Congress of Trade Unions to back it. And initially, they condemned it, but we forced them into making it official. And we brought about 2,500 people out on the streets in a strike against all forms of sectarian killing. That was a decisive turning point. It was a change in political terms, is what known as the objective situation. It was people saying enough is enough. And that began the instigation of the involvement, after all the years and decades of the troubles of a working class intervention. The Congress of Trade Union were forced to call a massive rally in Belfast, and it was massive. 20,000 people rallied to the centre of Belfast under the initiative that we had taken place here in the heart of Mid-Ulster. That showed that the mass working class people were not prepared to sit back anymore and allow this mayhem to continue on the streets. It was the turning point, 1992. Take a look at the history of the 1990s. The turning point of the working class, 2 years later, the ceasefire from the IRA, and 6 years later, the formation of the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement was brought about by the intervention of the working class people saying enough is enough, and that's what pulled in these political parties from the cold. When you look at the history of the intervention of the working class, the last really major one was in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement. It was a predominantly Catholic movement, the civil rights, the Bogside Uprising, people rising up against all forms of discrimination in housing and so on and so on. There was the lack of the intervention that should have happened then from the labour and the trade union movement in the North, which did not happen. But from a British perspective, that unity of the working class is what they fear the most. And that is why it was brutally crushed in 1972, Bloody Sunday. They crushed it. And 5 months before that, they crushed it in a working class area in West Belfast, Ballymurphy, for exactly the same reason. They feared the unity of the working class. That's why Bloody Sunday happened. That's why Ballymurphy happened. That is what they fear the most. And that is why we have to, and that is why the unity of the working class and the division that they've continued to keep, and it's not just here in the north of Ireland, as Roger says, imperialism will keep the division of the working class, using the national question in order to maintain capitalism that it prevails in the north of Ireland. I'll just finish on Thermos's point, because I think he's raised a very important point, because he's talked about bringing the left parties together. Now, where we are in the left parties, there are some left parties. There's one fairly prominent one here. It's called People Before Profit. In the south, they have a number of TDs. I think it's about maybe 6 TDs they have in the south. In the north, they have one member of the legislative parliament, Stormont, and they have a number of councillors. Now, 80% of the programme I would fully support, and what they're doing in health and social housing and so on and so on and so on. But when it comes to the national question, they support a border poll. And that immediately sets them in a division on the national question between Catholics and Protestants. That position, that is not a political party from that position that can unify the working class under the nationalist question. I've raised it at their meetings. They have difficulty defending themselves when it comes to that point, because they have based themselves effectively on division when it comes to the national question. The same likewise is with the Communist Party. The Communist Party is way far away from what Lenin approached to the national question anywhere in the world. They too position themselves into that position. Now, there are small. I mean, look, I'm a member of the militant left, and we have always had this position on the unity of the working class. And it's based very much on the program that I've just explained, uniting the people. But we're a very small organization. We have been able to instigate the trade union movement into action. It's taken, but it's following a political edge, not our size. We're very, very small, but it's having the right political direction in unifying the working class, particularly after an atrocity or an incident or a shitting of a police officer or something like that. There, we've been able to intervene because of our political program. But we believe the unity of the working class can take place, and that is based on the socialist program moving forward and building. And as Thermos correctly said, the national question is not a relevant question. It's absolutely fundamental to bring about peace and stability in the north of Ireland. These issues have to be addressed as we go along on the national question. What do we do? I mean, a citizens' assembly has been proposed by Sinn Féin. Well, okay, we would maybe consider a citizens' assembly to discuss the issues. These issues we picked up. But the point is, as you move forward on a socialist program, and if we ever achieve socialism, it's not so much that you come to the day, right, let's have a date to get rid of the border. That necessarily doesn't apply. What applies is the border becomes irrelevant. Under a socialist society in the north and the south of Ireland, that border effectively evaporates. It's no longer the same meaning. Would you still have to take up the national question? I suppose the answer is yes, you would, but it wouldn't have the same sectarian significance under socialism as it does under capitalism. Two very distinct. It is that new society. If you want to say it's idealistic, my answer to you, there's no other way. It has to move forward under the basis of the working class in the north and in the south. Thanks, Roger.
Yeah, thanks very much, Harry. Mike, over to you.
The divine rule thing that the capitalist class always uses, religion has been a big thing here that they've used, and they have to create a bogeyman in order to get people to go down the road of division and take sides. In 1964, Ian Paisley was a sort of an outsider, a mad preacher who actually got thrown out of the Presbyterian church and had to form his own church. He went out onto the streets and claimed that the IRA was taking over the country, that there was a great conspiracy, that Ulster, as he called Northern Ireland, was under threat, and that Britain would leave us and all the rest of it. And the fact is that the IRA at the time was basically defunct. It had been defeated 2 years earlier in the 56 to 62 border campaign, and they had about half a dozen members and even less weapons. So there was no real threat, and Paisley created the boogeyman by joining up with paramilitaries and bombing a water treatment plant and blaming it on this non-existent IRA. And that's stirred up the trouble, which led to all the conflict a few years later. One of the things that happened with deindustrialization under Thatcher was that a lot of Protestant working class people worked in heavy industry, and they all lost their jobs, and a lot of them became unemployed or ended up working in shops or either in the lowest paid jobs or just opting out of society and getting involved in drug dealing and criminality. And whenever you, as Harry said about us going to visit the bonfires, those people that we saw there didn't know anything about their own history. And where once they burned effigies of nationalist politicians and burned the tricolour and what have you, that had started to die down a bit. And so in order to keep the division going, you need another bogeyman. So in Britain, along comes Nigel Farage and the far right. And the people see, the people here with no education, yeah, that's the bit I forgot to tell you about, was that the Catholics who couldn't get a job throughout the history of Northern Ireland until the Troubles ended, basically, they got themselves educated and got all the good jobs. And they all moved on. So they weren't going to be sucked in by this right-wing rubbish. But the uneducated Protestant workers, they get sucked in by it. And if there wasn't one bogeyman, there was another, and the other was people coming in boats looking for refuge, Muslim shopkeepers, anybody that is different, that is a threat to their way of life as they see it, even though there is no real threat to them at all. The real threat are the very people that they support in politics. It's so we have to. Lenin said it'd be ideal for socialists to not have religious people to deal with. And Lenin said, you have to be very subtle about religion. You cannot face down people and say, oh no, you're wrong, there is no God, blah, blah. Because you'll distance them, you'll put them off and they'll not listen to you. So you have to deal with them. And one of the things that has to happen here is that the Protestant working class, they have to be shown that this identity thing based on a siege mentality from 1641 is not who they really are. That really they're a working class person, just like the guy on the other side of Belfast who goes into a Catholic church on a Sunday. And that's the way we need to win those people over. You cannot impose unity of Ireland without dealing with them in some way first. And I think that that's something that we need to do.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you to all the comrades who participated. If anybody would like to come back with a brief contribution, we could still have time. And in any case, I think it's been a really stimulating and imaginative discussion and very constructive. And I think I do thank all the comrades who participated. And obviously, it's not the end of the discussion. In a way, it's the same topic in a different manifestation, which comes up in every one of our meetings. Our meeting next week is actually directly flows from this discussion today. It's the third session of the conference at Wynn. We're discussing a document called Building the International, and I'll be leading off. It'll be a discussion on really how a world party of the working class can be built, a party which could encompass every section and every nationality and every division of the working class. That might seem very utopian and very fanciful, but actually it has existed. So in one form or another, worldwide organizations of the working class have existed in the past, and they're actually implicit in the situation today. When you look at all the struggles that are continuing, many of them uprisings which have just jumped over national boundaries Obviously, I'm not going to open up the discussion now, but I would urge all the comrades to participate and to encourage all the comrades you come in contact with who really like to have a full participation of comrades in and around the Workers' International Network. Tommy, by the way, you're always very welcome to come to our meetings. We meet every week, and your contribution would be very, very welcome. So, comrades, I hope to see you all next week. The document itself will be sent out tomorrow, and I hope comrades will have time to have a look over it first to prepare for the discussion. So thank you to all the comrades who participated, and I hope to see you soon. Bye, comrades.